pleasure to have you with us. I know it's difficult with so much happening at your end as well, and to take time out to talk to people in general and to address. So our objective is to kind of talk to people like yourselves and to take some learnings out of you, and send them out to the larger world and see if more people can pick it up from there and execute and use them in their own journey somewhere. Um, and this I thought was a good opportunity to have these kind of conversations. We all know COVID-19, is a black swan event, the worst of the kind we could have ever imagined as a world. It brought the whole world to a halt at one point in time, and it actually even now we're just beginning to crawl back. More in context of your business, the local grocery stores and supermarkets were seen completely deserted as more and more people, switched to online or started kind of just locking themselves up at home, and that kind of set the trend for online buying, in a mega way in the country. And of course, the online buying systems and patterns have then significantly changed over the particularly last 15 months. Big Basket saw almost 84% increase in its number of new customers and nearly about 40% increase in orders during the journey. What will be interesting to kind of start with is to maybe take you back 15 months, in the early days of March, when we were beginning to get a sense that something's not right in the world, and maybe something called COVID is going to arrive and hit us. So before you actually took the actions that you took in the organization, what was the thinking in the management team at Big Basket? I mean, when you first heard COVID and you knew that possibly there could be lockdowns and people may not be able to, or I don't know how it happened in your case. Would love to hear those days out from you.
Yes. So I think those were the days when, the world wasn't very sure. At least in India, we weren't very sure whether COVID is serious stuff or not. I know at that point of time, Europe was suffering badly, America was suffering, and there was some degree of bravado in India that, Indians are slightly different, more youthful. We are used to malaria, we're used to so many things, and COVID won't hit us. Until I think the momentous day, I think it was 24th March 2020, when the Prime Minister came and announced a 21-day lockdown after trying Bharat Bandh on one Sunday, announcing a 21-day lockdown. I think that's when reality hit everyone. It hit us as well. I think we saw, traffic, going through the roof, huge spike, and, people off the roads. And people off the roads means, our own employees, people who were, working for us in the warehouses, working, doing the deliveries, everyone. So on the one hand, people were sitting at home and hoping that somebody will deliver groceries and placing orders on companies like us. And we didn't have manpower to deliver those orders because our people were also sitting at home. They were equally scared. I think it took some time for the government, to bring about some clarity in, for instance, allowing essential services. I think for a country that's as large and as complex in India, communicating decisions unambiguously in a manner that everyone on the ground who needs to implement understands that is not easy. So in the beginning, I think everyone tasked with enforcing the lockdown could not easily differentiate between, what were essential services and what were not essential services. I think it took the government also to figure out what were essential services. So if you place an order on Flipkart for a television, delivering the television, was it essential? It took some time for the government. I think then they quickly got, their act together and announced that things like grocery, food delivery, all that will be essential. And in the beginning, our people had a tough time, especially when they were coming to work. I think they had to face the ire of the cops on the street. How do you prove that you're part of an essential services company? How do you, the policeman on the road does not recognize Big Basket. They don't recognize that, this is a company that delivers groceries. It's just for them any other private limited company. So why should you be on the road? So it took a while. I would say 3-4 days. 3-4 days during that period was a very, very long period. So I think all of us had to tweet. We had to draw the attention of policymakers, people who were enforcing stuff on the ground. talk to multiple, individuals to ensure that these things, kept happening. The essential services kept going. So I think that was it, 24th March 2020. On that day, I think reality hit all of us. It hit us as well.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. But, so from the point where, yes, obviously, I'm sure there was, you would have worked with the government, as you mentioned, some of it was, obviously on social media, but you would have tried out to the government officials to make some, kind of, to tell them exactly what you were trying to do and why it was important and so on and so forth. It will be good to know, how did you go about executing such a significant surge in volume that you would have seen suddenly? I mean, I'm sure there were task forces, I'm sure there were different teams handling. So considering the speed at which this whole execution happened at BigBasket is incredible. We talk about scaling up of organizations and all of that. I mean, this was something which was literally forced on you, and with practically no time given on, to you to react. We'll love to learn a little bit more about that. I mean, how did you go about executing this whole transformation?
So frankly, Ajay, it wasn't really rocket science. So I think we had a well-oiled machine. I think you just need to understand what exactly happened at that point of time. At that point of time, let's say our capacity was 100 and demand also was 100. But the moment lockdown hit, the demand went up from 100 to 500, capacity dropped from 100 to 20. So capacity was 20, demand was 500. That was the kind of gap. So we had to figure out, this is a very unreal situation. There's no way you're able to meet the demand. So the first question we asked ourselves was, what the hell is the customer looking for? So we realized the customer is not looking for exotic stuff to be delivered. They're not looking for gourmet food. They're not looking for anything exotic at all. They just want, some basic bundles of grocery, which is atta, dal, cooking oil, and a few essential items. We have 40,000 items on our website, which we, store in our warehouses. So we can deliver an assortment of 40,000. But customers, we realize, don't care for 40,000. And there lay the answer. We realize that they just want an assortment of 2,000. And we realize that, we have huge warehouses and 40,000 SKUs are stored in different parts of the warehouses. So a picker ends up walking anywhere between 12 to 16 kilometers every day to pick items.
Wow.
And that was not a very productive way in the new setup. So what we did was we rejigged the warehouse. The planograms we completely changed, and we co-located these 2,000 essential items. We took the 40,000 out into the periphery and co-located these 2,000 SKUs in a very small area. So pickers could just walk in, go pick the orders very easily, and the productivity jumped multiple fold. So on the warehousing side, we curtailed the assortment very significantly from 40,000 to 2,000. And we realized as long as you can deliver these 2,000 reliably, customers don't care about the remaining 38,000. At this point of time, they don't want any of that. They want those 2,000 to be available. When they go to your website, it can't show out of stock there. They're perfectly okay if they want to buy a pressure cooker or they want to buy, Gouda cheese from the Netherlands and they see it out of stock. They're okay. They will live without those. But they didn't want, these to be out of stock. So we figured out that these 2,000 should not be out of stock. They should be co-located. They should be available. Then we went back and began working with the manufacturers and distributors of these 2,000 essentials. Their supply chains were also completely disrupted. If you know the FMCG and other supply chains in India, crisscross movement across the country, goods and, in trucks moving across the country. Many of those services were disrupted. So we worked with companies like HUL, P&G, every single FMCG company to ensure that those 2,000 items, they keep their factories open and ensure that they deliver. And sometimes we couldn't dictate terms to them. They would decide what those 2,000 should be. And obviously their thinking was very similar to ours because the underlying logic was the same. So we also decided that we will work with those suppliers and we'll figure out what is it that they're continuing to produce pan-India. And those we will ensure that we keep in stock. So we worked very closely with all the manufacturers, distributors to ensure that for these 2,000 odd, assortment, the supply chain was working well. So that was number one. Number two, we did a lot of stuff in technology. For instance, we facilitated, I would say non-contact kind of a delivery. We facilitate that process immediately. Then we realized that, because people are coming into our website and trying to order far more than our capacity, people would not find slots. So for instance, I couldn't find a slot. When you go to Big Basket, place an order, there is no slot for the next 3 days, 4 days, and there are no slots. And you try after 10 minutes, try after 1 hour, try after 24 hours, no slots available. So that could be extremely frustrating. So the way we solved this was that, exactly like it happens in any, efficiently managed queue, which is you walk into an organization, to a hospital, walk into a bank, any place where, walk-ins are very high, you get a token. The moment you walk in, you get a token. If your token number is, let's say, 270, you realize that you don't have to wait there. You can go finish your other work. And if your 270 number token is expected to come after 3 hours, you can come back after 3 hours and, pick up whatever you have ordered. So we used the token system, which is essentially a tech innovation. Through tech, we created a token system. The moment a customer would come onto a website, they would find a token. And that token would tell you that, estimated time when your slot will be available is this. And when the slot becomes available, we will ping you. And you have to just place an order within 1 hour. You get a 1 hour window to place your order. So we took care of the customer problem, which is that don't worry, and you will get a token, and there is a guaranteed slot for you. It may not be today, but it will be there 3 days from now, but you are guaranteed it. So we did that. Then deliveries, we began working with, all communities, complexes, apartment complexes, villa complexes. We spoke to their, committees, and we all agreed between ourselves that they can place an order for the entire community with us. So we don't have to pick by individual customers. If there are 150 people in a community who want to order, there would be one person who would coordinate that and place an order. And we would pick up all the stuff for 150 people and deliver at their gate. And inside the gate, they took the responsibility of, further distributing that. So it helped, to get much more stuff done with a limited number of delivery boys. So I think these were not rocket science at all, just very, very small innovations that ensured that with limited number of people, we were able to serve more orders, more volumes, and more number of customers. So broadly, I would say those were some of the few things.
Well, Hari, this is humility at its best. I mean, what doesn't appear like rocket science today, I'm sure at the time when you were sitting on the drawing board 15 months ago, there were a lot of brains working together to figure out, what today sounds like a simple application of Pareto's principle, that, you gave up 38,000 items and focused on 2,000 is something that teach in management schools as a Pareto's principle. What you did in rejigging the warehouse is a classical case of operations research.
Correct.
And probably qualifies, all of these things that you kind of mentioned very humbly are actually 4 different case studies in operations research. So I think this is incredible work, and I'm sure this would have gone through multiple rounds of brainstorming and with some great brains working together to crack all of these issues. Another problem which I think then immediately came out after, life, at least people started to get their essential items and were beginning to at least live peacefully at home, thanks to organizations like yourselves, was the whole problem of physical contact. And I think there also you mentioned that you kind of worked on it. Tell us a little bit more about it. How did that whole, what was the thought process there? Obviously the delivery boys had to be kept safe. Also the customers had to be kept safe.
So those were the days when there were no vaccines. But we, just applied common sense based on what doctors were saying and based on what the medical community was telling us, which is that if you take care of 4 or 5 things very diligently, then COVID is a manageable, disease. And those 4 or 5 things were, using a mask regularly. Mask is very uncomfortable, especially in the beginning. People thought it's, the smart guys are unnecessarily insisting on a mask. You don't really need it. But I think we insisted on masking. Everyone had to mask up. Social distancing, we really ensured that social distancing was taken care of. And those days, the belief was that, the surfaces also could be infected. So we continued to sanitize all the surfaces in the workplaces, warehouses, and the individuals involved, they had to continuously keep washing their hands with sanitizers and soap. So sanitizing was very important. Social distancing was very important. We took masking very seriously. Then we also said stuff like, quarantine, which is that if there is a suspicion that somebody is infected, or actually tests prove that a person was infected, then very, very seriously quarantining. So testing extensively, quarantines, all of that we took very seriously. Education, we went out of the way to educate everyone involved. And we did audits regularly, which is that somebody who was not connected with the business would randomly audit a workplace and to figure out whether all the norms are being maintained or are people taking shortcuts. And if people were taking shortcuts, there would be some very serious consequences for those who were running the show at that point of time. So I think it's a combination of, being very strict on masks, use of masks, social distancing, sanitizing, testing, quarantine, lots of education. Before anything else, lots of education and auditing. Education is not sufficient. Education is essential, but people don't imbibe that education deeply unless there are some penal actions as well. So we put those also in place. So I think finally it was all of those that helped us. And in between, yes, people used to test. For instance, in a particular store, somebody would test positive. And in the early days, it was like this, which is that even if an individual tested positive in a facility, the entire facility would be sealed. So the officials from the health department in the city would come in and seal the entire facility. It took some time, for everyone in the system to understand. You don't have to necessarily seal a complete facility, but that was how the system reacted in the beginning. It was as if, the Andromeda strain or virus had come to us and we're all going to die if we don't shut the entire facility. So I think there was an element of ignorance on what to do. But I think some of those began getting solved. So when a facility was shut down, then we had to sanitize the whole facility and seek approval from the health authorities. Once again, the health authorities were also not very sure. So I think we all learned as a nation, I think we began learning those lessons collectively. So that was how it was, especially in the early days.
So how was the wave 2 different from the wave 1?
Wave 2, I think, was actually worse than wave 1 in terms of the kind of virulence, the kind of people who were impacted, the number of people who were impacted across our company. Obviously, that our company is a part of the country, a subset of the country, and therefore the number of cases were far more in case of the second wave. But I would say that second wave, there was a playbook that we already had written as part of the first wave. And that playbook, we just had to unleash, especially the playbook when it came to, assortment, the planogram design, 2000, the key 2000 items, managing the supply chain, working with apartment complexes, the entire technology related to providing tokens. We just had to open up the playbook that we had developed in the wave 1 and then unleash it in wave 2. But the wave 2 was, I would say, really tragic in terms of losing people that I don't think in wave 1 we really lost many people or anybody for that matter. But wave 2, you began losing people who were truly your near and dear ones, people you knew so well, their relations. So I think we began seeing a lot of tragedy in wave 2. The country saw the tragedy, and BigBasket, is a part of it.
That's true, and I think the fact that the back rooms and the teams had worked to set the playbook right, continue to make sure that the business continued to run and people were continued to serve despite the impact on the business. So so wave 2 we've kind of just navigated or in the process of navigating out of, and we're already talking of the wave 3. And there's obviously a lot of fear and paranoia around as to what is to be done next. So what are the thoughts there at BigBasket? I mean, Are you about vaccination of the delivery boys, the customers? Are you trying to set up some kind of a process to kind of look into that as well?
So some things are in your control as a company, and some things you just need to react as in when events unfold. So in terms of social distancing and equivalents, I think we've taken some calls, which is that we decided that we'll work until end September, work from home. But now we've taken the call that all employees, those who don't have to necessarily come into work, can work for all time to come from any location they want, which is that we're not going to insist that you come into an office to work. It is your call. You can work from anywhere in the country. But some jobs, obviously, you need to go to the warehouse, to pick orders. You need to, take the orders from the warehouse to the stores, to the customer doorstep. Those are unavoidable. So we are ensuring that every one of our employees, especially the blue collar staff that are more vulnerable, will be vaccinated and are being vaccinated as and when vaccine supplies are, being made available. And there is some degree of resistance across the country. Some of our employees also have shown vaccine reluctance to get vaccinated, doing a lot of education on that front. So that's happening. And beyond that, we have no idea how things will unfold.
All organizations continue to hire and empanel people remotely and digitally. In white collar space, it's much easier than in blue collar. So tell us some challenges around that as well, Hari. So I'm sure you were continuing to onboard more delivery partners because the transaction volumes were going through the roof. So how did that unfold, and how did you then make sure that your safety processes around background check, etc., were also religiously followed?
Yeah, so some things I would say, in a crisis like this, you can't expect that they will get done as well as they got done before the crisis.
Yeah.
But some things were never compromised. For instance, background checks we do extensively for delivery boys, because they enter customer homes and they are interacting with women, they are interacting with children, they are interacting with older senior citizens. So that is very important for us. So that is running like a well-oiled machine. I think what failed or what is not working anywhere as well as it worked in the past was the kind of induction that we would do, the kind of training that we would provide. And, all that I think is... if you ask me honestly, that is very suboptimal at this point of time. Because in the past, the way it worked was our grocery cycle was there would be a peak in the first 10 days. After that, it would be a bit of a, easy time relatively. So first 10 days is when everybody is ordering. So that's a huge peak. But after that, things get relaxed a little bit. And that's when there's a lot of time spent in training people, training newcomers, showing them around the place, getting them to observe more senior people performing their jobs, understanding the technology, the user interface, understanding the different issues of customer experience, getting together as groups in daily huddles. And those huddles are very important, not just from a knowledge dissemination perspective, but also from a bonding perspective, where you reward and recognize the people who are doing well, and everybody else can also cheer and learn from them. Those huddles are very, very critical element of managing a people-intensive business, especially in the blue-collar category. All that is not happening anywhere as well as it was happening earlier. But the point is that you learn to realize that in business sometimes you have to make a few sacrifices. You can never be perfect. Some process breaks are bound to happen. So maybe someday when our capacity, also builds up, because capacity building, which is long-term capacity building, takes time. I think at that point of time, and if COVID decides to relax a little bit, we will come back to the state of so-called near perfection that we did earlier. But in terms of customer experience, very frankly, it hasn't impacted very badly, which means that some of these processes, it's not that if they break a little bit, the customer experience would automatically get impacted. Sometimes it may not have a very direct correlation. So while some complaints have gone up, but I think overall, all well within limits. I think everybody is sympathetic. Everybody understands, the difficulties everyone is going through, and are far more understanding as well.
Right. So how difficult was it to convince the delivery partners to come to work? Because I'm sure, and there would be apprehensions there as well.
There are two components to this, Ajay. One is our, skills in convincing, and the other is the reality of India, Bharat as a nation, which is there are large number of poor people in India, truly, truly poor people, which is that if they don't earn for 15 days, the bank doesn't have any savings. So people like you and me, you can stay out of work for 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, and still nothing stops for our families. That's not the case with the majority of India. If they stop working for 15 days, they can't put food on the tables. So that's a reality. It's a sad reality, but that's the reality. So which is that after a point of time, you don't need to convince them. They will come back on their own. And you, in turn, I think you just need to, ensure that you respect that loyalty and commitment that they bring by ensuring safe working conditions, by ensuring that, you're taking good care of them. You're treating them with a lot of respect, like you would treat a soldier who's going to war. And they were nothing less than the healthcare professionals. The Prime Minister also called out the delivery boys as one category, like along with the healthcare professionals. So I think all that category of people need is genuinely being respected for what they're doing. I think all of us, feel a deep sense of inspiration when we are able to solve the nation's problem. When you are the only lifeline to the nation, I think the kind of happiness that you get. So if you ask me frankly, I don't know what extraordinary we did. I think they themselves felt that they were serving the needs of a nation by keeping citizens safe at home. I think they realized that themselves. And the other harsh reality is that, many of the people cannot afford not to work for long.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I mean, in your first book, Saying No to Jugaad, you talk about core values and the weightage and the value you attach to core values, and I mean, how did that play out in this context?
This is a good
people
question.
were really asked to stand up at a very different time.
Yes. That's a very good question, because you cannot create core values, nor can you create a culture in times of a crisis.
Yeah.
A crisis is the wrong time to create a culture. It's the wrong time to, upskill yourself. The right time for doing all of that is in good times, when there is no crisis. That's when you build culture. That's when you lay the foundation. And that culture gives you returns when there is a crisis. So if you've always been treating with people with respect, if you have been going out of your way to ensure their salaries are accurately paid on time, every time their questions are answered, they get the leave that they're entitled to, the supervisors don't say, no, you can't take leave because it's peak time, they are treated with respect, the right language is used, then I think that's when people, when there are bad times, they will stand by you. So I've always said, a crisis is absolutely the wrong time. In the good times, if you create the right kind of culture, I think in a crisis, you can potentially win. So I've always mentioned that, even in case of individuals, once you lose your job, that's not the right time to figure out what new skills I need to learn. The time to figure out what new skills to learn and am I learning every day is when things are going good for you. When you are in a steady job, that's when you should be thinking, am I complacent? What new skills should I learn? And then they'll pay off in difficult times.
That's true. I think that's, I agree with you. I mean, I think this is incredible that you put it so humbly and with years of experience behind it. I mean, the world's moving to what we all call the new normal, and nobody knows what the new normal is. For an organization of your size and stature, one of course is how is the online grocery business versus offline going to pan out in the next few years, and obviously the industry analysts give numbers, and the numbers are of course very, very inspiring for an organization like yourself. And the other piece is from an employee standpoint, how do you the challenges you just mentioned around engagement, etc. How do you see those challenges panning out in the new normal?
So I think you combined two questions. I think you talked of, I think e-commerce and online grocery market.
Online grocery market panning out.
Yeah.
In the next few years, and
let me try and respond to that first.
Sure.
So I think online grocery is bound to grow, and it's bound to grow faster than physical store-based grocery, undoubtedly, and that anyone can. You don't need any intelligence to be able to figure that out. So it's a new channel. You had various channels. You had the Kirana store, you had the small format retail stores. At one point of time, you had the modern retail stores like the Big Bazaar, and now you have an online store like a Big Basket. So Big Basket is an online store, and online commerce or online grocery is a new channel, and it's bound to grow faster than any other channel. So for instance, 2019, I think the approximate market size was less than $1.5 billion in 2019. And by 2023, that 1.5 billion is expected to become close to $10 billion. And from a market share of 0.2% in 2019 to almost 1.2% in 2023. So in absolute terms, the market is likely to be a $10 billion online grocery market, and the growth would be 100% CAGR, average compound average growth rate, which is a very good growth rate. But if you just look at the absolute number of $10 billion, it's just 1.2%, which is still scratching the surface, which is that when the grocery market is about $800 billion, the online is just about 10 billion. So it's a very, very minuscule number. So I would say it would continue to grow. And at some point of time, I think it would stabilize and the growth would peter off a little bit. I mean, we can talk about that at length. It depends on how long you want to talk about it. I have views on that. But I don't think modern retail will ever go away. I don't think the Kiranas will ever go away. Kiranas will remain the kings of grocery, and they should remain the kings of grocery. And companies like Big Basket will also have a place under the sun. There'll be space for everyone and all kinds of channels.
Right. You built a huge base of customers, and I'm sure this pandemic threw a lot of new challenges, as you mentioned. Did any of those challenges, or did this journey of last 15 years open any other opportunity for Big Basket within the online grocery space, or little maybe complementing to what you already do, which you started thinking about as a business? Or maybe you may or may not want to share that, but it'd be good to.
No, we can share. So there's nothing at all, no secret, I think. So ultimately, I think there are some new lines of business we had already started, and new categories. Beauties was a new category, and meats was a new category. And in both these categories, you have very specialized players, very, very competitive players, very good players, I would say. Like, for example, Nykaa. Nykaa is a company that many of us respect, and they've done a great job. So we are also in the beauty category. Now we are competing with Nykaa. Whether people will want to buy beauty products from a grocery store is something that we'll figure out slowly. We'll figure out how to brand it differently. We'll think of other ways. But beauty is a segment we have got into. We have the same assortment as Nykaa would have, 40,000 beauty SKUs. We're into the meats grocery. In the meat space, you have Licious, you have Go, Fresh to Home, very, very competitive and very admirable players. All of them have built their business beautifully. We have also entered that. So we will bring some of our strengths from grocery and managing, warehouses, logistics, supply chains into running these new categories as well. So we are hoping that we will build out some of these new categories. Tatas have acquired a majority stake at Big Basket. I think there will be synergies with the other Tata group companies, especially those in the digital space. We are likely to see some synergies. And you're also having, very interesting new plays. Reliance Jio has got into grocery in a very big way, JioMart. So I think the grocery market is interesting, but the beauty is that it's so big, $800 billion. I think you can have as many players as you want, and it's, the more the merrier. and the more the merrier for the customers, certainly. And I think it's a very good thing.
No, that's great, Hari, and thanks a lot for sharing the journey in the last 15 months. It's been a great learning for me definitely, and I'm sure for a lot of people who are listening in. Now, a few questions around you and quite a few things about your background that I really admire. One, of course, you as an author, and of course, being a avid professional yourself. So, question I see from the audience as well: how do you find time to write books that you did? I think it's one of my colleagues who's asked the question on the Q&A. Right?
So I think it's not many people have asked me this question before. I have written a short post on LinkedIn as well about this. I think at one level the answer is very simple, but at another level it may be slightly difficult to implement. And the reason why it's simple is that I think the myth of shortage of time is not true. I think the problem is never with time. The problem is with ambition and imagination. So, for instance, I think the reason why people don't have a lot of time is that they fill their time with useless activities. So, for instance, I've called something as, analysis paralysis, which is you don't know when to stop. There is a point of diminishing returns where, the time spent is far more than the incremental benefit that you can get out of any activity. And that's when you need to know, let me stop here. So I think that is one big thing. Other is that we keep ourselves so busy in activity traps. Activity traps means a trap of spending time on doing work which never matters, which nobody cares for, which doesn't create an outcome, an impact, doesn't impact customers, doesn't impact stakeholders, doesn't impact you. You don't learn nothing. Activity traps. All of us are busy. Just think about it. Activity traps. There are other things, which is that don't take the monkeys of others. Let people do their jobs. Hold them accountable, whether in your team or your peers. Don't jump in just because somebody is demonstrating an incompetence or not doing things on time. Let them fail. Let them learn how to do their jobs. And I would say go to the extent of saying let them learn how to do your job, because they begin to do your job, your time even gets more free. So I think there's so many ways. And the most important thing is that you face so many, problems, at work, in life. Demonstrate uncluttered and clear thinking when you look at those problems. So if you demonstrate uncluttered, clear thinking, a problem that will normally take 2 days to solve can be solved in 2 minutes. Because if you make the right assumptions, right approximations, bring all your past learnings, patterns into place to solve it, it just might take you 2 minutes to figure out what the problem is. Otherwise, you can, boil the ocean for 2 days and still not figure out what the problem is. So I think, time is just about, doing the right things, not doing the wrong things, doing things quickly, a lot of those, and demonstrating imagination, ambition, and wanting to do many things.
Yeah. On a different day and time, maybe I'll sit with you, Hari, to just learn from you how to go about writing a book. I mean, there is sometimes so much to learn and so much to share that, one is, of course, wanting to write, and the other one is knowing how to write. But this is incredible. Another very interesting question I see in the Q&A is from, so it's, would you say the order basket has changed significantly pre and post COVID?
What basket?
Order basket. So, you looked at the stock keeping units and you said in the first round there were 2,000 stock keeping units. And
yes.
Has that number changed? Has that kind of forced you to look at re-engineer your businesses and workflow? And
No. So that 2000 was a very short-term phenomenon. It was there only during the lockdown when supply chains were disrupted, items were not available, and demand was high, supply was low. So this was an answer to that particular situation. As wave 1 disappeared and things began returning to normal, we got back to 40,000 SKUs. So wave 2, again, we came back to 2,000, but very soon we'll go back to 40,000 because customers want 40,000 SKUs. They have they are very demanding. They have a range of choice. When I was a kid, we used to all shop at a store where the number of SKUs were less than 500. And when I was in college and early days of my career, if a store used to open in a big city with 3,000, 4,000 SKUs, we used to all wonder what a store it was. Now 40,000 is insufficient. So I think people in some ways, are consuming a variety of stuff. That won't change. We'll have to go back to that.
Another question from the audience here is, out of the 4 zones in India, which zone was the most difficult zone to operate in terms of fulfilling the demand during the COVID times? Did you see a difference in customer behavior patterns, in the last 1 year across the country?
Nothing really worth calling out, Ajay. I think from time to time there were challenges in every city, every state. Things got sorted out on time. But I don't think there was a pattern to say this was a place or an area where we found extraordinary challenges or anything.
Okay. So a lot of processes and SKUs that were set up and identified were kind of very common, or at least broadly very common across the categories. Were very common across the country.
Okay. Largely correct.
Okay. I'll switch a few questions to you as an author and an individual who's seen the journey of a company of the scale of BigBasket right from the day zero to where it is today. To any entrepreneur who's looking at starting up, what are the top 3 things you would advise? Whether he's starting up now or starting up later, what are your top 3 advices to any entrepreneur who looks at starting a business?
So, by the way, I wasn't with BigBasket from day zero. I was there after it was almost 4 years old, not 3.5 years old, almost, till it is 11 years old. So if you ask me what advice, I think it would depend upon the stage of the startup. If it's a very early stage entrepreneur thinking of an idea and wanting to start up, then I would say that, around 3 or 4 things. One is you should start up for all the right reasons, which is that you should deeply be passionate about something. You should be wanting to solve a problem that's keeping you awake at night. You should feel that you have an answer to that problem and you are the person who can answer that question or solve the problem better than most other people. And you want to create an impact. I think if that's the reason for starting up, you should start up. I think having said that, I think some people still want to do something differently, which is that they won't want to solve a big problem. So sometimes they may not be very passionate about a problem, but the problem is big, and therefore I can build a company around that. And maybe it's easier to build a company around something which is a big problem. That's also okay. When it comes to advising entrepreneurs who are scaling, who have already built a product taken it to a certain stage, got to the right product market fit, I would say you should just read this book, which is Pony to Unicorn: Scaling a Startup Sustainably. This is for startups which have hit a product market fit. Customers are pretty much lining up outside their door because they love their product and are willing to pay for it. But you are not sure how to scale it or the kind of challenges that you go through while scaling. We've covered everything in that book. Very difficult to say it in short, I would say.
Yeah, but what an incredible co-author to have in that book, Sanjeev Agarwal, and who's somebody who's built IBM to Daksh to where it is today, and now it's of course gone through multiple transitions. But yeah, I think it must have been an amazing. Definitely, I'm sure a lot of people are going to pick that up very soon. There are very few books in India that have been written on journey of an entrepreneur and what an entrepreneur goes through in the journey. In fact, we see global books, but I hardly see anything which is written in more Indian context. So I'm sure these books will be incredibly useful. So that's great. I think this has been a tremendous session. It was really, really nice talking to you and understanding how the last 15 months have gone by and how did BigBasket transition into this, into the scale that it was asked to suddenly get into, the challenges you guys navigated through, and then how you moved through the journey. Incredible to see how the core values of the organization and the culture of the organization came in handy at the time of distress, and of course always great to hear from you on the learnings you've had working with entrepreneurs in your own career. This is incredible. Thank you so much, Hari, for your time today.